Welcome to the in-text citation mini session given live by Joy Hewitt and read now by Abby Heilman. Students in college often have to do research, and learning to cite your sources correctly in a paper is very important. While you need to list your sources in works cited format, you also have to give credit to any ideas that you borrowed from those sources in your paper itself. Give credit where credit is due. This may be a cliche, but if you summarize someone else's ideas, paraphrase their ideas in your own contemporary language, or take a direct quote from that source, you must cite it. It makes you seem more credible if you've used an authority or expert in your paper, so that in itself is a great reason to give them credit. But without giving credit to that source, you're in danger of plagiarizing, and that's considered cheating when you take someone else's work and treat it like it's your own. This mini session will cover some of the basics, and there are resources like the MLA Handbook, textbooks, and web links that can give you more detail as you need them for documentation. Remember, better safe than sorry. If it's not common knowledge, like AIDS is an epidemic, or most teens can get a license to drive at 16, be sure to cite it. That includes statistics that you've gotten from a website, numbers most wouldn't remember, a quote that you've borrowed and then changed a few words. You still have to put that source directly in the text where you use it. So, whether you're summarizing or quoting, you have to provide that documentation both in the paper and in the work cited. The citations have to match in the text to what you have listed on your work cited page. To avoid unintentional plagiarism, document your research as you go along. Whether quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing information from a source, make a note of it when you're doing research. You'll need to have the page numbers and the source material saved, either electronically or handwritten. Identify your source and page as you take notes, and this will save you heartache later. You have to give your source credit both in your paper and on the works cited page, so you might as well get in the habit of doing this as you take your initial notes. Here's an example of what some note-taking might look like. Over on the left, we have an actual source report from a database. Very often, if you go and use databases to find information, you have the ability to email the source to yourself. And so you have the name of the journal, the date, the volume, the page numbers, the author, all of that pertinent information that you need for both your in-text citations and your works cited page. Over on the right, here's an example of a sample note card that you might use. And again, the same information, and then that particular quote that you want and the particular page that that quote is located on. MLA standards recommend that you should draft your works cited list in advance, even though it appears at the end of your paper. The reason for this is because by creating the works cited entry first, you know exactly which information to use in your in-text or parenthetical citations. So now we're going to go through some examples of how to cite within your paper. This is what a basic citation for a book or an article would look like. And in most citations that you do, you're going to be using the author's last name and the page number that you found the information on. So by looking at this example, the author's name is Smith and the information was on page 23. You put that in parentheses at the end of the sentence and the period goes at the very end. And notice that when we put the page number, there is no comma after the author's name, nor is there the page or the abbreviation of page. It's just the author and the number. Moving forward, an attribution or an acknowledgement phrase. The first time that you use a source, it makes you look more well established as an author if you give the expert's area of expertise or introduce that source instead of just dropping the quote into your paper. So the example that follows speaks to the author's name, Margaret Mead, and then introduces her particular position, a well-known cultural anthropologist, and then leads into the quotation. And you'll notice that at the end, in the parenthetical citation, there are only page numbers. And the reason for this is because we've already mentioned the author's name in our attribution or acknowledgement phrase. So again, when you mention the author before you introduce the quote or the paraphrased portion of text that you're using, you will only need the page number and the parenthetical citation at the end. The author's name within your text. If the source is given in your sentence, you only have to include the page number. And that was something that we just pointed out before, but here's two more examples. Richard Ellman is mentioned at the beginning of this first example, so we only need the page number at the end. Same thing with air quality expert James Hughes. He's mentioned before the paraphrase content, and thus we only need the page number. And remember, the period always goes at the very, very end of the sentence. Oftentimes, a particular source will not list an author. They call this an unsigned article. And so if there is no author, you're encouraged by MLA formatting rules to use a few key words from the beginning of the title. In the example that follows, The Meaning of Life is a rather short title, so you could use that entire title, but it's recommended that you just take the first 2 or 3 words from the title. And so instead of the author's last name and page 26, we put in quotation marks the first few words of that title, followed by the page number. So that title literally takes place of the author. And the keywords, again, are in quotation marks because they're taken from the title of the article. Sometimes you might find a corporate or a government company that you want to use. And in the example that follows, the United Nations is a, government agency that could have written an article or had someone write an article on behalf of them. And so as the example states, you would simply introduce that and use the United Nations as an author as opposed to an actual author. And as part of your text or your sentence, according to a study sponsored by the United Nations, there's that introduction, and the United Nations is technically your author, so the parenthetical citation needs only to have the page numbers. Web-based sources. Web-based sources are really, really big nowadays, considering the way that the website and the internet itself is based, and the amount of databases that can be used across college campuses. So within these web-based sources, very often you might not find page numbers, especially if it's a website or a particular database. And so in place of those page numbers, we would encourage you to use the paragraph number from which you got the information. So if you're looking at a website that has 7 paragraphs and you found the information in the 4th paragraph, you would cite the author's name, and then a comma followed by paragraph whatever. And that follows in the example, Smith. And remember, when we normally cite an author and a page number, there is no comma after the last name. But there is in this particular instance, and this is the only instance that you would use that comma. Oftentimes, an article or a book or whatever source you're using might have multiple authors. And so you can either list the authors by their last names in the order in which they're given, separating their names with the word and, as is shown by the first example, or you can use the phrase et al. That basically means that you're including the rest of them. So Smith was the first one listed, so that's going to be the first name listed on your works cited page. And this et al. Tells everyone that there are multiple authors for whatever source that is. Very often, you might find sources where authors have written more than one of the works that you're using. And so if your paper does contain 2 or more works by the same author, you give the author's last name followed by those key words from the beginning of the title and the page number. We do this to clarify, or rather distinguish, between one article over another. And giving credit when you're paraphrasing or summarizing. Just because you paraphrased or summarized does not mean that you do not have to cite. You may have changed the wording around so that it's coming from, your vocabulary, but the bottom line is you did not get that idea on your own. You received it from another source. And so you have to do the same citations when we're paraphrasing. And the only difference really between a paraphrase and a quotation mark is that there are no a paraphrase and a quotation is that there are no quotation marks. Again, you've used your own words, but the example shows you that the parenthetical citation is the same. Last name, page number. Quotes and punctuation. The general thing that you need to remember here is that the quote itself lives within the quotation marks. Everything else, the parenthetical citation and the period, go on the outside. So if you look at the example, you have your quotation, and the quotation mark ends after the word love because that's the last word from the quote. Then you have the parenthetical citation, and the period goes all the way at the end to include all of that information within one sentence. Now, sometimes you might have a quote that ends in a question mark or an exclamation point, and those particular exclamations or marks will go within quotations. You will then add an extra period at the end of the citation. So any quote that you might use that has a question mark or an exclamation point, you're going to have two pieces of punctuation. And let's take a look at these examples. In the first example, how can I miss you if you won't go away? The question mark is within the quotation marks, and then there's an additional period after the parenthetical citation. Long quotes that are more than 4 lines. You want to introduce that quotation and indent the quote. So at the conclusion of The Lord of the Flies, Ralph and the other boys realize the horror of their actions. There's your colon to introduce, and you'll notice that every line of that long quotation is indented within the paper. One big change that also needs to be noted about long quotes, if you look at the very end, the parenthetical citation comes after the period on these long quotation marks. Ordinarily, the period always comes at the end, but in this instance, and only this instance, you will put the period before the parenthetical citation. An indirect citation. If you're reading about something that an author has said and they've quoted an individual within their source, you have to give credit with the words quoted in. So it's represented by QTD period and the word in. For example, let's say you read an article by Michael Levinson in which he quotes James Joyce. So to quote Joyce and then cite Levinson, you would introduce the statement saying that Joyce commented. You would provide the quote with the quotation marks, and then instead of just listing Levinson and 168, you have to have that quoted in beforehand. That's an immediate indicator to your reader that yes, you pulled this quote from Levinson's article, but Levinson was quoting someone else. That's what we call an indirect citation. Finally, an interview as a source. And all you would need to include on this citation would be the person's name in the text or in the parentheses as you would do the author, but there are no page numbers required. So this example, there's actually no citation whatsoever at the end because Bill Gates is a very well-known person. But if it was someone less well-known, you might put their last name in parentheses after the quotation mark and move the period to the very end. If you've included information from the same author, but it's come from different pages or different paragraphs, then you also have to notate those citations. So if we look at the example, on page 77 from Ellman's source, we have pulled out a quote of extremely unhappy. But then the very next sentence comes from the following page. And so we have to indicate that there was a break in this information. And we do that by saying at the end of the first sentence, Ellman, page 77. But then notice that on the second sentence, you only need the page number. You're indicating to your reader, this is coming from the same author. It's just in a different place than that first quote was from. Now, in the live session, students were given an opportunity to sit down and practice with these in-text citations, to use an acknowledgement phrase or introduce a short summary or paraphrase an idea from a quotation, and they were given hands-on assistance from Miss Hewitt as she delivered this session live. Because we don't have that opportunity here, I'm simply going to show you the quote and then move forward and show you the examples of what's right and what's wrong. So we have a very long quote here, and you may be required to sum up this idea. This is something that students are going to have to do very often. You have a lot of information and you want to take the most important part out of it. So we read through it. I maintain that in today's perilous world, anthropologists have many productive ideas and much useful information to share with the public in general and policymakers in particular. To make such ideas and information more accessible, anthropologists need to further strengthen their public outreach. I argue here that one potentially fruitful way to facilitate such outreach is to have more anthropologists become visible, recognized public intellectuals, just as Margaret Mead so successfully was in the past. Now, moving forward, here's the information about the author. His name is Jeremy Sobloff. He's an anthropology professor at Santa Fe State University. His article appears in the American Anthropologist periodical on pages 408 through 416, and that particular quote that we just reviewed was found on page 408. So that is all the pertinent information that you need, well, rather all the most immediate information that you would need to cite the source. So if we look here, this is the works cited entry of the source. You would have the author's last name followed by the first, the title of the article within quotation marks, the name of the periodical that they got it from, italicized, that's American Anthropologist. And because this is an anthology or a collection, there's many editions and many volumes, and that's what 113.2 represents. It's issue 113, volume 2. Followed by the year that it was published and the pages that it is located in. Beyond that, we have to include Academic Search Complete as the web database that we use to find this journal and thusly to find this article. Finally, you have to indicate that you found it on the web, and November 4th, 2013 represents the date that a student may have accessed that. Now, some potential answers for summing up that big long quotation mark that we looked at. There are two examples here. One of them, anthropology professor at Santa Fe State, Jeremy Sobloff, says that anthropologists need to reach out to the public to make their ideas accessible the way Margaret Mead did. Now here, this person chose to summarize or paraphrase it. And since we've already mentioned the author within the sentence, we only need the page number at the end. The same can be said about the second example, and it's just a different way of summarizing that big phrase. Now, it's really important to avoid plagiarism when you're using a source, okay? And if you refer back to previous slides that have that really long quotation mark, you'll know that this first entry is wrong. Santa Fe State professor Jeremy Sobloff maintains that anthropologists have many productive ideas and much useful information to share with the public in general and policymakers in particular. Now, this is wrong for two reasons. One, if we refer back to that long quote, this is an actual specific quote, so there are no quotation marks. So that's stealing information and passing it off as your own. And secondly, they've mentioned the author's name, but they did not indicate the page number where this information or this quote could be found. So below follows a correction. Santa Fe State professor argues. There's your quotation marks and your page. And that is the end of the in-text citation. Should you need more information, please feel free to contact your English instructors or schedule an appointment in the Writing and Reading Center. Thank you so much.